everyone. So this is the second phase of our training programs on NDCs, and also the second session on the second phase conducted by the UNTP on taking a deeper dive on NDCs, and also an overview of NDC analysis. So I will hand it over to Rebecca and Verania now to carry out the program, and feel free to present your questions and so on as we go. Rebecca and Verania, the stage is yours.
Thanks a lot. My name is Rebecca Carmen. I work in UNDP headquarters on NDCs with the NDC support program and also the climate promise that we're going to be speaking to you about. And Verania, I'll maybe let you also introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, good morning, evening, afternoon, everyone. My name is Verania Chow. I'm Program Specialist on Climate, Gender and Inclusion, supporting the integration of gender and social inclusion into the NDC process, and also based at headquarters. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to kick this presentation off and then hand over to Verania. She'll hand back to me. We're probably going to speak for about 40 minutes. We'll try and stay on time, but we tend to get very excited about NDCs and like to talk about them quite a lot. So we'll do our best. And then, obviously leave time at the end for questions and answers. And we will also be sharing the presentation after this. So, just to let you know that you'll also have a copy of that. So essentially, when we prepared this presentation, we really tried to do our best to build on the training with WRI last week, where I know there was a discussion around Paris Agreement and also sort of the NDC process sort of at a slightly higher level. I also recall that at least at the training that I participated in, that most people sort of had a pretty good handle on this. So I do hope that, this is beneficial to you, this training. So perhaps just to start off with, what the structure of this presentation, we will be sort of just doing a very sort of touch base with you right now. We're going to share with you some of the trends from UNDP's climate promise. And then sort of look at sort of the NDC process in general and sort of how that is structured, and then sort of, look at some of these questions around NDC ambition. One thing that I did want to mention is that, the countries that we typically work with are not necessarily the countries that you are sort of planning to target under this initiative. But nonetheless, we do sort of hope that some of what we've learned and some of what we're seeing would still be nonetheless sort of, helpful for you and sort of provide some insights and thinking as you move along into this process. So just very quickly, I just wanted to very briefly sort of recap on one of the big questions from last week, which was, really about, why prepare NDCs and the importance. And, a lot of this, I do think you already know, but, these NDCs really are the sort of the engine of the Paris Agreement, and essential for raising ambition. I think one of the important things as well is, it is an opportunity for a country, developing countries especially to sort of look at their adaptive responses and resilience of their vulnerable communities through this process. And I think an equally important thing is, for a lot of countries, it's really not enough that this is about sort of, achieving these global goals. You've also got to sort of have incentives for national stakeholders. So I think, what's really, really important as we move forwards is how do we really use NDCs as this sort of vehicle to create opportunities for economic growth and development, and that can be in different ways, whether that's through attracting climate finance or other investments, taking the opportunity to sort of leapfrog and move to sort of newer technologies, to really build on the actions that might already be taking place, either subnationally or through non-state actors. And so, you know, I think it's a really important aspect that we do have to think about, you know, is sort of the carrots alongside what some may perceive as to be sticks when we start to talk about ambition. And there's also just other opportunities to really sort of, you know, create these synergies with SDGs and improve the sort of institutional structures at the country level. And then again, one thing I know again that the ambition mechanism was sort of spoken to in some detail last week. So one thing I just really wanted to emphasize here is that, you know, UNDP has been involved in NDCs from the outset. Even from before 2015. With the UNFCCC, we began supporting regional technical dialogues that really brought together developed and developing parties to really sort of talk about what these NDCs were going to look like, and you know, to create a sort of a neutral setting for those discussions to take place. And so all of the work that we've sort of done since that time, supporting intended nationally determined contributions, supporting the sort of the post-Paris process, up until now, has really all sort of fed into our sort of theory of change and the experiences that we sort of bring and have offering through the Climate Promise. So with that sort of just brief introduction, I'm going to hand over now to Verania to sort of speak a little bit more about some of the trends that we've been seeing under the Climate Promise, and also to explain what the promise is to those of you who perhaps have not heard of it. Over to you, Verania.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. Sure. So then, as we continue with the presentation, so we will focus on UNDP's Climate Promise more in depth, and then look at the trends, look at how it's been structured, etc. So next one, please. Thank you. Yep. That one, yeah, thank you. So UNDP's Climate Promise is the largest global offer on NDC enhancement, and we are currently supporting 118 countries in collaboration with many partners, like 35 partners, and we are also supporting countries in pretty much all the regions. It is important to say that the Climate Promise was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit in September 2019, and it was UNDP's commitment to ensure that any country wishing to increase the ambition of their national climate pledges was able to do so. So to really put, you know, the capacities in place for countries to achieve these major commitment. And the Climate Promise support draws upon UNDP's extensive portfolio and the experience that we have across different areas of work, and also sectors such as like energy or forest, or even the work that we have been doing with youth on finance or on gender equality. And it also builds upon UNDP's established track record in supporting governments to discuss and to design and plan and basically deliver climate action under the Paris Agreement. So we were kind of like one of these partners that had the capacity and the opportunity to support countries on the ground in really increase their ambition through the revision process of the NDCs. The next one, please. So the Climate Promise was framed around 5 core service areas that could be tailored to country context and sectoral priorities. So it responded directly to country needs. This is important to mention, that were identified from a survey of 130 developing countries. Also, this is important to mention. Our main pool, let's say, of countries are developing countries, which was also the basis of the UNDP UNFCCC 2019 the Heat is On report that you may be familiar with. The core principles are alignment with national priorities and SDGs. This is really important to ensure ownership, make optimal use of UNDP's portfolio and expertise as a contribution to the enhancement. So as I said, really taking advantage of previous work in different areas and the expertise that the organization has, and create synergies or build upon the efforts of other development partners. So this idea of partnerships and synergies also is very important. As a result of the Climate Promise support, I think we are seeing that countries NDCs are stronger, more ambitious, more inclusive, and we expect that they will be easier to implement. So having the right data at hand, having also detailed costings, and to link the commitments to the development agenda and to the sectoral planning will definitely ensure that countries have a better situation to act upon. Next one, please. So the trends that we are seeing on different areas or themes is, so for instance, in terms of mitigation action. So despite COVID-19, the majority of countries still plan to raise mitigation ambition, including over 70% of climate promise countries. And so we see that also there has been kind of like an increase. We are thinking that this will even increase to up to 73% of climate promise countries, indicating that they are likely to increase mitigation and ambition. As we know, there are still quite a few countries that haven't submitted their revised NDCs. However, we also need to acknowledge that there are a few countries, and it's interesting to say that your organization has also identified. I was reviewing some background information that we had on your organization, and I realized the good analysis and work that you have been doing in terms of identifying some countries that may not increase mitigation ambition, such as, for instance, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, or Turkey. So I think it's interesting also to point out the opportunities for the future or for the next round of NDCs in this regard. Next one, please. In terms of adaptation ambition, so we are seeing that adaptation is gaining momentum. It's been also considered as important as mitigation, and 97% of climate promise countries intend to raise adaptation and ambition. Also, we are seeing that it's really important that adaptation ambition is linked to more concrete targets in this regard, and so there is a good intention and work around linking other climate instruments or policy or planning instruments such as the NAPs with the NDC work. Next one, please. In terms of the thematic approaches, so basically kind of like the sectoral references or the sectors that we see countries focusing more or prioritizing, we see that energy, agriculture, and forest are at the heart of the climate promise NDCs. So 79% of countries are updating or adding energy-related actions and or targets to their NDCs. Over half of the climate promise countries are also strengthening inclusion of nature-based solutions. Many of these nature-based solutions are linked to agriculture, forest, and land use. And over 50 countries requested LULUCF-related support, primarily focused on forests. So, for example, we have in Thailand the example where the private sector climate expenditure and institutional review, a process that it's mainly led by the Ministry of Finance, aims to help kind of like beef up the role of the financial institutions in investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So we are also seeing the connection from the work under these sectors to the specific climate instruments and other means of implementation, such as the finance aspect. Next one, please. Then, in terms of sorry, can you? I think you went back, so maybe if you can. Next one, and then next, yeah, there, yeah, thank you. So of course this is this is one of my favorite trends, right? In the sense that so enhanced NDCs aim to be increasingly inclusive and country driven, and we are seeing greater inclusion in this regard. So we see that for 94% of climate promise countries prioritizing political will and societal ownership as part of their NDC enhancement. 97% of countries including gender responsive activities in work plans, and 75% of climate promise countries prioritizing youth. So these are being, through engagement processes and consultations. It's also been taking place through, for instance, knowing much and understanding much better the gender differentiated climate change impacts through gender analysis, for instance. So this is how countries are kind of building this link to these social dimensions. Next one, please. Another important trend, and particularly due to the current circumstances, is that countries are linking NDCs with COVID-19 recovery efforts, and I think this is a really good opportunity and could be another important entry point for climate activists. I think it's important to consider the need of utilizing NDCs and COVID-19, for instance, socioeconomic impact assessments to advocate for or to identify priorities for green recovery. So there is a need to build forward better, right? So then this trend, it's really pointing out the opportunity that there is out there for countries, but not only countries, the societies within these countries to push for it. Next one, please. So now I will focus more on introducing the NDC process. So how is that, it's been kind of like framed, and what are the main kind of building blocks to start this process. Next one, please. So I would like just to highlight that, there are kind of 4 key steps or decision points of the NDC process, and these steps are kind of based on the UNDP and WRI 2019 guidance document that walks users through a series of specific questions, to respond to, and so to be able to structure this process in a consistent manner. So one of these steps is about like establishing a clear and inclusive process to guide the NDC enhancement. As you may know, the first round of NDCs were, many times not shared with key actors or in collaboration with other key line ministries or sectors or even civil society. It was so there was a need, of really open up this planning and designing process. The next one is about the designing and enhanced mitigation within the NDC. So that's the main focus, right? We don't have to lose our focus in terms of our Paris Agreement target, and so that was another part of the process. And then also the third one would be designing enhanced adaptation contents of NDC. As we, as I already mentioned, and as we know, like, in the first round of NDCs, not all of the countries included adaptation, or not equally as mitigation, and this is changing more and more, so that was important to consider. And the last one is about transparently communicating the enhanced NDC in accordance with the Paris rule book. So this is another area that it's really important in terms of the data, in terms of the reporting and the verification process that needs to take place. The next one, please. So here it's I would like to share, kind of like how we could establish this clear and inclusive process for the NDC enhancement, and kind of like recognize the importance of this clear process to ensure that ambition is increased, and also to ensure that implementation is more robust. And so there are a few points that I would like to mention. One is that, the NDC enhancement benefits from buy-in at the highest level of government and from clear and coordinated institutional arrangements. So the governance structures become really relevant to make sure that all actors, so this idea of the whole of government is really working, as well as the whole of society. Then the second one, and that relates to my last point, is that I just mentioned, is this robust stakeholder engagement process that can greatly strengthen support for the enhanced NDC, and particularly, in the next phase of implementation. The third point is that, explicitly articulating the domestic objectives of the NDC enhancement can focus attention on key interventions. So as we mentioned also before, this idea of linking, the NDC to the development priorities that are taking place to other relevant agendas, such as the SDGs, for instance. And then finally, a work plan with clear roles and responsibilities helps drive the process forward. So this was also important, and particularly in the sense of building capacities within the countries, because as you know, the idea of these continuous cycle of NDCs, this every 5 years, it's aimed to increase these capacities within the country. So every time the NDCs are more robust and stronger, and of course ambitious. Next slide, please. And so there are a few examples here. For instance, in the case of the Marshall Islands, where the idea was securing this high-level buy-in, and it was important to note that there was a focus on having the highest level really pushing for this process. So at the presidential level, there was an intention also of making sure that social dimensions such as gender or human rights were incorporated, and this was relevant to for their linking to the development priorities, and also to make sure that ambition was also linked to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience. The next one, please. There is another example in Peru that it's called Let's Talk About the NDCs. And basically the government launched this highly participatory process, to engage national and local stakeholders, to include the private sector. We have been saying, many times that, the private sector is a key. It's a key actor, and so we need to make sure that they understand the NDCs, they understand the commitments, and they chip in and they contribute to this effort and to these commitments. And of course there are other key actors that we know are kind of like the providing all these safeguards when it comes to biodiversity conservation. So indigenous peoples and civil society working in different areas, for instance, like gender equality or women's empowerment, would be. So there is, as I said, like a need of open up the process to be more inclusive, to make sure that also there is a clear role for the different actors. It's not only about consulting the actors, but it's about having a clear role for each of them. Next one, please. And then in terms of what we are seeing as preliminary results, for instance, under the area of work on gender and social inclusion. So we are seeing that there are like 41 submitted NDCs from climate promise countries, and out of these 41, 38 have integrated gender dimensions into various degrees. There are also 18 countries that now include gender, for instance, and did not not in the first NDCs. The main focus of the work in this area is to really improve the understanding, the knowledge, the information, and the capacity of countries to incorporate gender in a transformative manner at this policy level, and to bridge this policy level to the implementation side of the climate change agenda. And then the next one and the final from my side. Thank you. So it's another example in Chile about incorporating a just transition into an NDC. So there is this need also to consider that there will be definitely changes. We expect actually these changes to happen. We expect new value chains, for instance, to be in place, new business cases, etc. And of course, there will be different opportunities for different groups of people. And so we need to make sure that there is equity and there is equality behind the decision-making process. So this is another area that has been important to link to the NDC designing and revision process, but also it will be very significant when it comes to implementation. So I will leave it there and then hand it over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks, Verania. So I'm going to deep dive a little bit more about the sort of the raising of NDC ambition, which I know is your sort of big focus area. And I think one of the elephants in the room, so to speak, when we start to talk about ambition and raising ambition, is about is it about mitigation or is it about adaptation? And, there was a lot of discussion. And in fact, the WRI UNDP guidance, you might have noticed, is talking about sort of strengthening national climate plans. There's a lot of discussion around enhancing NDCs. In the purest form, of course, when we talk about ambition, we're talking about emission reductions. And then, the other options that a country has is to, improve or strengthen some of the data and information in the NDC, to provide some updates to that information, to sort of look at strengthening adaptation goals and so forth. And all of that really is about sort of, improvements to the NDC, but not necessarily leading to emission reductions. I think one important thing is that, for a lot of countries that we're working with, they can't necessarily move the needle in the same way in terms of emission reductions, which I think is important to note. But I think what a lot of the countries that we work with can bring to the table is sort of a bit of a sort of a conscience in the room of the negotiations and so forth, and sort of showing that by the leadership that they can show in terms of ambition, really sort of inviting others to step up to the plate as well. So in the guidance that we did prepare with, we really sort of looked at these sort of key entry points for NDC enhancement, and sort of ways that you could improve and strengthen the NDC. And so the entry points there were around mitigation, they were around adaptation. One of the other ways that a country can sort of strengthen its NDC certainly is looking at the means of implementation. That was a sort of a weaker area in a lot of the first NDCs, really sort of making the case and explaining how the enabling environment and plans there could really create the opportunities for scaling up investments in climate action. And then, of course, the other sort of key area of improving an NDC or enhancing it is around sort of what is communicated and how transparent is that, how clear is it, how comparable is it going to be. I'm going to really just focus on the mitigation side, but one thing I just did want to flag about adaptation is that this is, a very important area for countries, but it's also, you know, a quite complex area. You know, the underlying information that countries need to obtain in terms of vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, the indicators for monitoring and evaluation, it's all very complex. And a lot of countries really just aren't necessarily maybe where they need to be right now in terms of having all of that information. A lot of them are still just, for example, still working on their national adaptation plans and or policies and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be sort of still done in that space, despite its importance. And then something else I just sort of want to mention just briefly around this sort of notion of, you know, transparency and the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement, and what is communicated. You know, these are sort of really a list of some of the sort of key aspects that we would be wanting to sort of see in an NDC, and that, you know, as you're moving forwards and trying to sort of assess NDCs, you know, these are sort of some of the things that you would be wanting to look for. And again, these are all drawn from this WRI UNDP guidance document. But, you know, to the extent that countries are being very clear about, you know, the timeframes, how quantifiable or quantified are the mitigation targets, you know, the scope and coverage, how clear is that? You know, what are the assumptions that have been made in terms of what's been put into the NDC? You know, what is the reference point or base year? You know, what, you know, speaking to this means of implementation, you know, what planning processes have been undertaken, what institutional arrangements are in place to either prepare or implement the NDC. All of those are sort of, you know, factors that we would, you know, clearly like to be seeing in the NDC in a very sort of clearly articulated way. And of course, all countries as part of this process do explain, you know, why to them they consider that the NDC that they're submitting to be sort of fair and ambitious, because these are, of course, nationally determined contributions. In terms of sort of unpacking the enhancement step or phase of the mitigation component. I don't know how clear this slide is, and I apologize if it's not very clear to you, but in the guidance document, it certainly is a little bit clearer. But just to sort of say, there really are sort of these 4 key entry points for a country to think about, you know, strengthening the mitigation component of their NDC. One of them is, you know, if there is a GHG target in there, to either strengthen that or to add an emission reduction target to the NDC. The second one is that they can sort of strengthen or add a non-GHG target for a particular sector. They can also strengthen or add policies and actions that might be relevant in terms of mitigation. And finally, they could look at sort of strengthening or aligning the implementation of the NDC with longer term goals, whether that be the Paris Agreement global goals or a long-term strategy that they may have nationally. And so each of these sort of key entry points for looking at mitigation ambition, there are sort of different choices that a country can make. And one thing that I just want to flag is that, you know, as you will certainly find as you start to look at some of these, it can get quite complex quite quickly, you know, and some of the choices that a country may make in terms of their ambition, you know, aren't necessarily going to be easy to measure immediately, which is why the global stocktake is going to be such a critical part of the whole sort of Paris Agreement sort of framework and understanding how we're progressing. Because, for example, one of the ways that a country could argue that it is looking to raise its ambition is to achieve its targets earlier than it previously estimated. So by doing that, they could, you know, come back and revisit and sort of more easily ratchet up in the next NDC. But that's not something that's going to be necessarily easy to sort of judge immediately. So there are, you know, some of these sort of challenges that have to be considered as you're sort of looking at ambition. And the other thing is just to sort of say, you know, a country can also choose to make that mitigation reduction target. They could reach it in different ways. Again, sort of like looking at these sort of 4 main entry points. If the priority, for example, is to realize, you know, this potential that they have to increase, you know, renewable energy penetration in the power sector. This is one example. They could, one way of doing that in the NDC would be they could strengthen their economy-wide NDC target if they have it, you know, based on the assumption that there's going to be this greater share of renewable electricity moving forwards. Or they might choose, if they chose the second pillar, to either establish or strengthen a renewable energy target that they may already have. So, you know, that one comes is really about sort of, you know, seeking an outcome. And then they could alternatively choose to describe sort of planned policies and actions that are going to take advantage of those renewable opportunities. So there you're sort of coming in much more closely as a country into committing yourself to a certain sort of way forward. You're really starting to define policies and actions. Whereas if you were just sort of looking at your this broad GHG target, you know, there's a lot of flexibility built into that for a country in terms of how it's going to achieve that. And finally, as I had sort of mentioned earlier, you know, there is also this option to, you know, maybe be aligning the power sector sort of with these longer term goals. So just to sort of say there are, you know, very different pathways that a country could take, and they're not also mutually exclusive. A country could select, you know, one or more of these in terms of raising ambition. And then one other thing, you know, in terms of sort of these approaches, one of the things that I did want to mention is that, you know, for a lot of developing countries, especially, and this won't necessarily be the case for some of the countries that you're going to be sort of targeting and looking at, but still, nonetheless, for some of the developing countries, you know, their previous national greenhouse gas inventories and so forth, you know, would certainly have included carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. But these other sort of gases, you know, that are quite potent greenhouse gases, there may not be the sort of the same data and information on that. So the ones that I've sort of highlighted in orange are the ones that you'll sort of potentially have seen less of in a country's previous sort of national reports, but are certainly ways that countries are now moving to also strengthen their NDCs potentially. And so one example of that is with Kenya, for example, where they did include some of these other gases that previously they hadn't been sort of tracking and reporting on in their NDC. Another example that I just wanted to highlight is Nigeria, you know, which I would sort of say their way of addressing or realizing ambition was really to sort of move to fill a number of gaps. They, under their first NDC, had 5 priority sectors, which were power, oil and gas, agriculture, industry, and transport, you know, which are already, frankly, very important sectors for a country like Nigeria to be looking at. So they have been, especially with UNDP support, but also other partner support, they've been looking to sort of strengthen the information base for those priority sectors. They've been looking to quantify targets for those sectors, also looking at improving the costing and information around them, so that they can also have a better sort of investment strategy to accompany the NDC. In addition, though, they've also incorporated for the second NDC that they are looking to include the waste sector, and they're also looking at the water sector as part of this process. They've expanded the gases that they are looking at, as I sort of mentioned, from those sort of 3 traditional ones that you sort of seen to covering, you know, 11 pollutant gases. And they've also updated the base year for their assessment. So they've really, you know, been looking at raising ambition in quite a wide number of ways. And just to sort of give you a flavour again of different ways that countries are doing this, North Macedonia is one of the countries we've been working with that, has really taken some very big steps forward in terms of their commitment to ambition. So they have this new pledge of, an 82% reduction in net greenhouse gases by 2030 compared to 1990. That revision process that was supported looked at 63 policies and measures that were analysed, and also they brought in this sort of green recovery, build forward better, they called it, approach to addressing sort of the challenges of COVID and the recovery from that pandemic alongside the NDC. Some of the things that they're looking at, and that things that I think become very important for policymakers, are certainly looking at how this greening of the economy will potentially create new jobs by 2030. I think one of the important discussions, and Verania highlighted it a little bit before, but it is about balancing sectors that will lose jobs through this sort of having that just transition process, but also really emphasizing having things in place to sort of support reskilling and so forth. They also are looking at a shift to a circular economy that would both reduce emission reductions, create new jobs, and also looks to sort of generate significant income for the country. Another aspect of this NDC process was that they did create, quite strong social ownership of the NDC revision process. There's been inclusion of gender-responsive policies and analyses, especially looking at the impact of these NDC measures on vulnerable communities within the population. They've also had a very strong youth engagement process for this work. They also, equally importantly, brought in the private sector through, and have brought in their sort of commitments and engagement. And so one of the things is that the private sector is looking to be able to deliver around 85% of the investments needed for the implementation of policies and measures in the industrial sector. So essentially, their domestic private sector is stepping up to sort of support that. And finally, they did this analysis of looking at the NDC targets and the SDGs, where are the trade-offs and where are the synergies, and found that there was this very strong argument that could be made for how the NDC could help drive the SDG process and achieve those sort of bigger national development gains. And then just quickly, in Argentina, one of the sort of solutions, I would say the big sort of wins there has been sort of the subnational ownership and engagement in Argentina's revised NDC. And again, just to say, when we talk about the sort of the complexity of the numbers behind the NDC, one of the things that UNDP did support was, the development of 17 emission scenarios that considered a range of mitigation measures across a range of key sectors, also looking at key growth rates and making assumptions about that. So, just to say that sometimes there's, quite a big sort of complexity of analysis that's sitting underneath the NDCs. But then having also then the opportunity to sort of have the subnational governments sort of come in and sort of be behind this increased commitment was critical, because quite often I think what you will find is that where the rubber really hits the road, so to speak, is at the subnational level, whether that's cities or territories who really have to, implement a lot of this work. Again, Argentina made sure that their NDC was gender responsive and mainstream gender within that, brought in the SDGs again. And again, it's an example where there was a very consultative youth engagement process. And then I'm just going to end with two examples also that I thought might be interesting as you're sort of thinking about framing or thinking about how do you sort of assess NDC ambition. And these are to sort of look at it from the donor perspective, because, you know, for a lot of developing countries, so maybe not for all of the countries that you're working with, but again, just to sort of be thinking about some of these things. So sort of two donor perspectives that also explain, again, why sometimes it's a bit hard to understand ambition as well. So the NAMA facility had put out an ambition call this year, which is dedicated to sort of supporting sort of key priorities and projects that have been included in countries' NDCs, where they sort of consider them to be more ambitious. So, you know, they sort of looked at the way that they were defining that, you know, mitigation targets that sort of show this reduction in these economy-wide targets that we mentioned, or it could be a rapid reduction of GHGs in a key emitting sector. It could be looking at a way to create an early peaking of GHG emissions, or, you know, creating an alignment with an existing net zero target if the country has that. So, you know, that sort of is how they were assessing ambition. And one of the things that I just wanted to mention was that in addition to sort of either strengthening these mitigation targets and actions over time, or broadening the scope of the NDC, or looking at, you know, adding in additional targets, one of the ways that they were looking at ambition was, you know, is the country moving from a conditional target to an unconditional target? That is, are they sort of showing their climate leadership by choosing to sort of take on more work domestically and fund more of these emission reduction targets domestically? And that sort of becomes interesting, because then the next example, which is the engagement that we've been doing with Switzerland and these questions around unconditional and conditional targets, is that you can have the flip side of that argument, which is that you will have other donors that are only going to sort of commit climate finance for conditional NDC activities. And that is the case, at least for some of the work that Switzerland is supporting. They are looking to support conditional NDC actions in the country's NDC, because they don't want to interfere with what the developing country has decided they can do on their own. They want to sort of support this other sort of area. So it's just to sort of say that when you look at those conditional versus unconditional targets and try and decide, is the country being more ambitious or not, there may be also other sort of decision processes behind that the government is also trying to make in terms of where they're going to attract their finance from, you know, obviously for developing countries. And then just one other slide very quickly that I did want to mention that we will be sharing is we did develop what we've called a quality assurance checklist for the climate promise countries that we're working with. And one of the things that it tried to do was really sort of look at some of these questions again of ambition. It also looks at adaptation. It looks at the sort of the engagement process. Is that, how inclusive is that? You know, to sort of just try and understand in a fairly simple way of, you know, comparing, you know, an NDC to the previous one, you know, where are we sort of seeing the changes, or where are there sort of further opportunities for improvement? So again, it's something that we will share with you, but it is sort of based on our other existing guidance. So it's sort of just something that could be perhaps a sort of a helpful framework, or for you as you're sort of thinking about this moving forwards. And with that, I'm going to stop talking about NDCs for a minute and sort of invite you to also raise your hands or provide feedback, or if you have clarifying questions and so forth, we'd be happy to hear them. Understanding we just threw a lot of information at you, so apologies for that.
Hey everyone, so the floor is open for you to ask questions, so please go ahead.
or perhaps just while you're thinking of some questions to ask us, you're very welcome. I just will mention that we've added a couple of slides at the back of this that we'll be sending with you that are just, again, some of the materials that we have. So, you can certainly be looking at these and getting some ideas. So, the WRI UNDP guidance that I mentioned, Veronia's done some great analytical work around sort of gender and the NDCs, the quality checklist, some insights that we took away from 2020. And we also have the Heaters On report that we mentioned and other sort of sector guidance looking at green recovery. So these are all sort of information that could be helpful to you. And then one thing I know that WRI mentioned their sort of Climate Watch database and portal last week. I just wanted to mention we use that a lot as well. We think it's fantastic. So again, I think it's sort of very helpful. And I know you're also aware of the Climate Action Tracker, but just to sort of say that, I do think there's these other sort of helpful tools out there for you as well, as you're sort of embarking on trying to, assess ambition further. So yeah, and I'll stop again.
And perhaps I may suggest if there are not maybe like concrete questions regarding the presentation, perhaps colleagues can share, what is that they are currently doing, or how do they see, their entry points for their work? Is it, so I see now John raising his hand. Go ahead, please.
John, you are muted.
Hello. Hello. My name is John from DRC. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, my question is from the slide where you mentioned the difference between a different definition of climate ambition. So I would ask you the question why the NDCs are not more likely to submitted by the middle income countries. Why not? Just also the developing countries. This is my question.
Maybe I'll start. Well, I think one thing is that at least some developed countries are, indicating or have, raised ambition of their NDCs. I think one of the challenges obviously is that, we're still not close enough to where we need to be in terms of urgent action. So, and having said that, I mean, there are also some higher emitter countries, major emitters that really do need to step up. I think there are a few different mechanisms that are used. Some of the more ambitious developed countries do sort of really try and advocate for greater ambition from others. So you will sort of see, for example, right now it's the UK presidency, seeking to really encourage that for Glasgow. So we have a successful COP. In other cases, what you may find is that non-party stakeholders or subnational actors may step in to avoid if a national government is not stepping up. And that's something that you quite often see in the US, where there tends to be a bit of a swing according to the sort of who's in power around, how ambitious or not that they are on climate change. But what you do sort of see is a fairly steady drumbeat on ambition from the subnational level in the US. And I think increasingly what we are seeing is that, as pension funds recognize the risks of climate change, as investors recognize the risk of climate change, as civil society steps up and sort of calls for more climate action. All of these, provide, I think, the argument for governments to then do the same. So I think sometimes it's a bit of a push and pull, and it can sometimes just frankly just depend on who is it governing at a certain time with the country. The ambition can sort of move to in the past has sometimes gone backwards sometimes and then forwards. I think that is one goal, obviously, under the Paris Agreement, is to sort of put in place that there can't be that backsliding. Another way of looking at that, I think, is also what are the other ways that we can sort of lock in some of these things so it doesn't also become so dependent on who's in power in different countries at different times, in those government changes. Rani, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
No, thank you, Rebecca. Not to that. I could maybe respond to the question about how could NDCs can be completed. But yeah, not to that one specifically. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions on the chat, so we can take them up now. Yeah,
perfect. Yeah, so perhaps I can take the one on so how could NDCs can be completed? I don't know if I'm understanding correctly the question, but if it's about when the NDC is it's kind of done, is as we were saying. So this is a process, a designing process, right? So then usually within a country and within the government, there is a governmental institution that is leading the process. In many cases, the leading agency or institution is the Ministry of Environment, and so is the Ministry of Environment that will they must complete this work along with many other governmental institutions, but also in many cases, as we already shared, there is an inclusion of other actors that are not necessarily part of the government. So the NDC is basically completed when the government finalizes their designing process of the main components of the NDC, the main commitments, when they decide whether the specific priorities or commitments will be on a mitigation and or adaptation, on what specific level, etc. So that's when the NDC is completed, and then the NDC is submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat, as kind of like to formalize their commitments. And every 5 years, it is expected that the NDCs will be revised, and it will and ambition needs to be increased. So every time the NDCs should be better in terms of the commitments, but also in terms of the process. So as I was mentioning during my presentation, so in the previous round of NDCs, there was not necessarily, in many cases, a practice where, other, for instance, governmental institutions or sectors were participating in the designing of the NDC. Was mainly driven by the Ministry of Environment, but without consulting with other key ministries, for instance, with Ministry of Planning or Ministry of Finance. During the revision process, this has been changing, and so now there was a need of creating, for instance, coordination mechanisms, to ensure that all of these other actors could participate as part of the designing process. So I hope that answers the question of how can this be completed. Now, once the NDC is completed, submitted to the UNFCCC, then it becomes, you know, the next phase, which is the implementation of the measures and the actions that were indicated or stated in the NDCs. And I think that links to the other question, and Rebecca, if you also want to add to this one, like that it says, what about the monitoring and the following of the NDCs? Yeah, definitely. The countries are responsible to do that, and they are also responsible to report back to the convention. So definitely this relates to what we were referring to as the transparency framework. So the transparency framework, you know, it gives guidance in terms of the mechanisms and the tools that the countries need to put at their disposal to be able to report back on their progress and how they are achieving their commitments. So yes, there is kind of like a commitment to report back on the progress in this regard. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to add to that response. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to mention that, you know, once you know, at the upcoming COP in Glasgow, I mean, one of the questions that's been under discussion in the informal sessions that just took place on this under the subsidiary bodies was to also discuss the global stocktake, which comes up in 2023. So there was a lot of discussion around what is the information that's going to feed into that global stocktake. And one of the big questions actually is around non-party stakeholders, because there's an expectation that there will be a lot of inputs from non-party stakeholders, or a lot of desire from non-party stakeholders to contribute to that process. So that is sort of one of the things that is a question. And so again, just to flag that, I think that is potentially an opportunity, you know, for also, you know, beyond the NDC process, you know, finding these additional entry points to, you know, continue to be sort of advocating for action. So it's not just the NDC, you know, there's always going to be the stocktake process, and then the government's going to, based on that, should then start to design or, you know, revise their next NDC and you know, look at where they're going to raise ambition again. So, you know, as this becomes sort of more of a cycle, you know, what we would hope to see are sort of more robust sort of stakeholder engagement platforms nationally, where, you know, there are these opportunities to engage with the different stakeholder groups in a country. And then in terms of, you know, who is doing the measuring, reporting and verification, again, you know, the Ministry of Environment is typically going to be sort of coordinating that process, but you know, other sectoral ministries, for example, would most likely be contributing to that and providing some of the information and so forth. So again, there are these processes in place for that. So, you know, I think the expectation is that we would be, you know, really starting to sort of ground this work moving forwards. There was also a question here about UNDP supporting NDCs in a country like Somalia. Just to mention that when we did launch the Climate Promise, we invited all countries that we work with to offered support to all of them to sort of support the NDC enhancement process. You know, in some cases, UNDP is in the lead. In some cases, we're just sort of coming in to sort of, you know, back up and support some sort of coordination and so forth. So it varied quite a bit country by country. I can't remember off the top of my head right now if Somalia is one of the countries that we're supporting, but I can double check. I'm just too afraid to turn off my screen, because then I think you'll see all of my other windows, because I don't know how to stop presenting. But we can double check that for you and let you know. But also UNDP does have a Climate Promise website that you can just Google, and on there we do list all of the countries that we are currently supporting, and it also just shows which of those countries have submitted and which are still pending submission. We are expecting quite a big number to try and make the deadline of end of July, which is for inclusion in the UNFCCC's analysis of the NDCs.
Rebecca, if you want, I can add to that. Yeah, so Somalia is one of the countries that are part of the NDC support program, and basically the overall, let's say, objective of the overarching objective for them during the revision process, I mean, for our national counterparts, was to support Somalia in update the data, the information baseline, and basically, to prioritize the specific actions to implement the NDC. And also they were intending to conduct this process of raising awareness around non-binding mitigation mitigation targets. So so that's kind of like in general terms what they were thinking of achieving through the revision process. I'm also looking at, for instance, they didn't follow like a sector-based approach in setting the priorities, but the revision process, it's been an opportunity to identify the specific actions around thematic sectors that are relevant to the country. Yeah, thank you.
And maybe just to add to that, and again, just as a sort of a point of reference in terms of mitigation ambition, in some cases, we have a sense, of whether a country is going to increase ambition or not, just based on a country office and what the sense that they're getting from the government. And sometimes, a government is, has been sort of reluctant to make those sort of decisions until they really have done a bit of a stock take and understood, like what's happened since they submitted their first NDC, and they want to do some of that analysis before they, sort of come forward and really make those decisions. So just to sort of say, I think what Varani was just explaining there for Somalia is a quite good example of where, quite often, countries want to just, update the data, update the information, and sort of get a sense of the landscape before they really think about their sort of decisions of what they're going to include.
All right, everyone. Are there any more questions as we reach the sort of the conclusion of the session today? All right, so I would like to sort of put everything in context as well. So in the context of the YUP4NDCs or Youth Rising YUP4NDCs projects also, so we are now coming into the second month of this project, and the capacity building sessions are now, we are almost at the end of that segment. So the intention was to give knowledge to the participants and the members of the initiative to have a good understanding of what constitutes as a NDC and what are the specific elements that they should go into and check, because we understand from our experience that most of the NDCs in the format tends to be different from each other when you go from country to country, and so it's really important that you have a generic overview when you are going into a NDC as for what elements that you should look for and what elements might be missing, and you would know. So I think the content presented by Varania and Rebecca today really captured certain elements that we should look for. And also, if we are to take a deeper dive in the analysis, what trends we should pursue as well. So that is the whole objective of the sort of the capacity building sessions, and I think it was fulfilled through these sessions. And we really thank you, Rebecca and Rania, for that. And so I will just give a sort of an overview of what's coming ahead as well. So the next step would be now to jump into the analysis part, specifically sort of coming up with a framework that we could give to any young person, and they can go ahead and jump into analysis of a NDC document. So that is the sort of the next phase. So I think we took a very good start based on these sessions for that. And after that framework is sort of built up, then we will go on to analyze NDCs of 17 countries and make a sort of a report back. So the country teams are already established, and I think more and more young people after these sessions will join these country teams, and they will have their own individual go at it first, and then they will come together and present a common understanding of where those NDCs are standing at the moment. And then the next step would be to approach those countries and actually um, engage with them and give pointers and guidance of what sort of an ambition is required going ahead. So that is going to be the sort of the last phase going into this year until closer to this year's COP. And then I think the next year the program would focus on looking at which countries presented updates and which countries didn't, and what sort of further ambition and push from our side that is needed. So that is like the overall picture going ahead. I think we will surely stay in touch with you as well on how we do and what questions we have, and also if young people in between come with certain questions and resource needs, we will also refer to you. So I will say a final thank you for Verania and Rebecca, and we are really happy that you were able to put this together in a very short notice as well.
It's our pleasure.
Right.
And
see you, everyone.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you very much.
Interested to see what comes out. Thank you.
Sure.
See you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.